On July 3, 1941, 11 days into the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany's Army Chief of Staff put it in writing. The campaign would be over in 2 weeks. It lasted 4 more years. The men who survived left behind letters and secret recordings. What they said about the enemy was nothing like the official picture. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, most German soldiers entered Soviet territory with a confident set of assumptions. Political education sessions held in the months before the invasion had reinforced a consistent message. The Red Army was poorly trained, ideologically coerced, and led by incompetent commissars who held their men at gunpoint. Official pamphlets circulated through Wehrmacht units describing the Soviet soldier as racially inferior and militarily negligible. Many men believed them. Letters home from the first weeks struck a brisk, optimistic tone. Historian Klaus Latzel, who analyzed thousands of German Feldpost letters written between 1941 and 44, found that soldiers' correspondence frequently echoed official propaganda. Soldiers wrote about rapid advances, enormous prisoner columns, and the apparent disintegration of Soviet resistance. On July 3, 1941, just 11 days into the invasion, Army Chief of Staff Franz Halder wrote in his diary that the campaign would likely be won within 2 weeks. That assessment was shared widely among senior commanders and filtered down through the ranks. The first signs that something was wrong appeared almost immediately. German forces expected Soviet soldiers to surrender quickly when encircled. In the border battles of late June and early July 1941, some units did collapse under the shock of the initial assault, but others did not. Encircled Soviet formations continued fighting from forests and marshes, attacking German supply lines and refusing to accept that the battle was over. German units moving east reported ambushes in areas they thought had already been cleared. The orderly collapse that propaganda had promised was not materializing everywhere. Then came the armor. When German anti-tank crews encountered the Soviet T-34 in significant numbers during the summer of 1941, standard 37mm rounds bounced off its sloped hull at normal combat ranges. The vehicle outclassed most German tanks of the period in both protection and firepower. German commanders submitted urgent reports requesting heavier anti-tank equipment. Some crews facing T-34s with ineffective weapons resorted to planting explosive charges by hand. The gap between what soldiers had been told about Soviet military capability and what they were actually encountering was already becoming visible. By October 1941, the tone of German letters had begun to shift. Where optimistic early dispatches had described rapid advances and imminent victory, later correspondence spoke of confusion, fatigue, and an enemy that refused to break. The Red Army had absorbed catastrophic losses in the opening months and was still fighting. According to Latzel's research, references to a quick victory had already begun fading from private correspondence by this point. The campaign was entering its 5th month. Winter had not yet arrived. In November 1941, German forces stalled outside Moscow. Temperatures along the central front dropped to -35°C in places, and the Wehrmacht had not been equipped for it. Soldiers wrapped newspaper inside their boots, used engine oil that froze overnight, and fired weapons that jammed in the cold. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers east and could not keep up with demand for winter clothing, fuel, or spare parts. Units that had advanced confidently through the summer now dug into frozen ground with inadequate tools, waiting for conditions that showed no sign of improving. The Soviet soldier they faced in that winter operated in a fundamentally different way. Red Army units moved through forests at night using white camouflage that made them nearly invisible against snow. They launched attacks in temperatures that paralyzed German defensive responses, striking positions where men were too cold to react quickly and withdrawing before reinforcements could arrive. German field reports from December 1941 and January 1942 described an enemy who navigated terrain that Wehrmacht units could not cross, who pressed attacks in conditions that Germans had assumed would halt all movement, and who showed no signs of reducing operations as winter deepened. This pattern forced a rethinking that went beyond tactics. German soldiers had been told that they were fighting an enemy incapable of initiative, dependent on fear and compulsion to keep moving. What they observed instead were men who navigated winter terrain without hesitation, exploited darkness, and responded to field conditions with apparent ease. For soldiers raised on propaganda that denied these qualities to Soviet fighters, the experience created what historian Omer Bartov described as a kind of split consciousness. Ideological belief and battlefield experience existed side by side, neither fully cancelling the other out. Infiltration tactics added a psychological dimension that wore on German units throughout the winter. Soviet soldiers would slip through gaps in defensive lines at night, cut telephone wire, and position themselves behind German positions before dawn. The uncertainty this created was exhausting. Soldiers could not be certain that ground they had taken was still secure. Sleep became difficult. Units that had pressed forward through open country in summer were now spending nights listening for movement in the tree line, their grip on the tactical picture gone. By the spring of 1942, the shift in German correspondence had become unmistakable. Letters that had once described Soviet soldiers dismissively now recorded frustration, caution, and in some cases a grudging acknowledgement of their endurance. The men writing home were not describing the enemy they had been promised, but what they had experienced in the winter was nothing compared to what was coming. In August 1942, German forces entered Stalingrad. Senior commanders expected it to fall within the week. 5 months of close-quarters fighting followed, combat that became one of the most studied battles in military history. For the German soldiers inside the city, it produced a set of experiences with an enemy they were still learning to understand. Urban combat dismantled the tactics that had carried the Wehrmacht across open ground. Inside Stalingrad, Soviet defenders used the rubble of bombed buildings as fortified positions, tunneling between basements, placing snipers in collapsed stairwells, and launching counterattacks from sewers and factory floors. Ground that had been cleared in the morning was often reoccupied by nightfall. German units measured their daily advances in meters rather than kilometers. The formal military structures that German soldiers had been trained to fight against had been replaced by something more fluid, more patient, and far harder to locate and destroy. Soviet snipers became a particular source of psychological pressure. Vasily Zaitsev, operating inside Stalingrad with the 284th Rifle Division, accumulated 225 confirmed kills between November and December 1942 alone. He was one of many. German soldiers moving between positions during daylight hours faced the constant threat of a shot from a concealed position they could not identify. Units began moving at night, abandoning daylight patrols in contested areas. The fear of an unseen enemy operating with precision had a lasting effect on morale that went well beyond the physical casualties involved. Then there were the forces that German soldiers had not been told to expect at all. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, a Soviet all-female unit that came to be known as the Night Witches, flew over 23,000 combat sorties during the war, including raids over the Stalingrad front. Flying light biplanes at low altitude with engines cut to reduce sound, they dropped bombs on German positions in near total darkness. German soldiers who experienced these raids described the difficulty of locating aircraft they could barely hear and could not see. Across the wider Soviet military, approximately 800,000 women served in active roles, including as pilots, snipers, tank crew, and frontline medics. This reality contradicted German assumptions at a fundamental level. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the remnants of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Approximately 91,000 men went into Soviet captivity, one of the largest single capitulations of German forces during the entire war. Writing after the war, General Erhard Raus, in a report compiled for the US Army in 1950, noted plainly that Soviet forces had become measurably more capable as the war progressed, refining their tactics, improving their logistics, and learning from early defeats in ways that German commanders had not anticipated and had not prepared their men to face. The clearest window into what German soldiers actually thought about their Soviet opponents did not come from official reports or post-war memoirs. It comes from conversations they believed were private. From 1940 onward, British intelligence housed German prisoners of war at Trent Park, a country estate in North London, and at several related facilities. The rooms and gardens were wired with hidden microphones installed behind skirting boards, in light fittings and along garden paths. Prisoners spoke freely, unaware they were being recorded. The transcripts ran to approximately 150,000 pages. In 2011, historians Zonka Neitzel and Harold Welzer published Soldaten, a systematic analysis of those recordings. What emerged was a portrait of German soldiers that differed significantly from the image projected by wartime propaganda. In private conversations, soldiers acknowledged Soviet resilience, commented on the skill of the Red Army units they had faced, and expressed a respect they would not have voiced in official contexts. The language still contained the ideological framing of their upbringing, but underneath it ran a consistent thread of recognition. These were not the helpless, driven conscripts that pamphlets had described. The men who had fought them knew it. Klaus Latzel's broader analysis of German Feldpost correspondence confirmed the same pattern through a different source. Letters written in 1941 and letters written in 1943 described different wars. The early confidence gave way to more measured and often grimmer assessment. Soldiers wrote about Soviet units that recovered quickly from losses, about an enemy that contested every building and every tree line, about a front that gave no sense of approaching an end. The shift was not sudden, it built across months of hard experience that propaganda could not explain away. Post-war memoirs by senior German commanders reinforced what private letters and secret recordings had already established. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Heinz Guderian both credited Soviet forces with significant tactical and operational improvement over the course of the war. Their accounts noted that Red Army commanders improved faster than German planners had anticipated, that Soviet industry replaced losses at a scale that repeatedly surprised German intelligence, and that the individual Soviet soldier proved far more capable than pre-war assessments had suggested. Neither man wrote about an inferior enemy. What those sources taken together reveal is a gap that widened steadily between 1941 and 1945. German soldiers entered the Soviet Union carrying an ideological certainty about the enemy they would face. The battlefield returned a different answer, month after month, year after year. By the time the war ended, the men who had survived it understood exactly who they had been fighting. The propaganda had told them otherwise. 4 years and millions of lives later, the evidence was impossible to ignore. If you found this video insightful, watch What Did German Generals Think of Allied Generals next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history inside. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.